The first theme is about our deep human desire to belong, specifically to belong in a group, and that has a powerful pull. And then the second is a sheep-like tendency to follow the flock. And if we're honest, I think that has more of a pull on each of us than we care to admit, but that's powerful too. And these first two are kind of eternal ones. They've been around for thousands of years, and they kind of pull and influence how we think about risk. And then you overlay on the third, which I think is much newer, and that is that in the West, we live in a culture that I think is increasingly wired for comfort and for ease. So think of like an Uber.
If ever you felt like playing it safe might actually be more dangerous, then this video podcast is definitely for you. My name is Gemma Cairns-Smith, investment specialist at Ruffer, and this morning I'm delighted to be joined by Ruffer's chief executive, Chris Bacon. And we're here to discuss his article, Risk Backwards, from the 2026 Ruffer Review. Now, in Chris's article, he describes how modern day life rewards comfort, conformity, and this topic he describes as blanding, which is basically smoothing over disagreements to create the illusion of safety. And he suggests 5 antidotes to this, each tied to a decade of his life. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Gemma.
To discuss your article. Now, I wonder, just to kick us off, what inspired you to write this piece, Risk Backwards?
Yeah, sure. So in my mind, these things tend to emerge when I'm on holiday. And this one started out when I was in holiday in Wales last summer. And the topic I kept circling around was risk.
Okay.
And risk is like one of those big concept words. Yeah. So justice would be a similar one.
Yeah.
That's just kind of, they're in the background of our lives. Like intuitively, we have a sense and a feeling for what they are. But I found myself, when you start to grapple with it and ask questions, you chat to people like, what is risk? It's a bit more of a grapple and a wrestle than I actually thought. So that's kind of some of where it started. And then obviously that's a massive topic. Yeah. So the idea that I could do justice and say anything meaningful to that in like 5,000 words, that's at least one book, maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So I can't do justice to the whole topic. If risk is like a great city, like London, I thought, okay, well, I can't do justice to the whole thing, but maybe we could explore a few of the streets in the city, and that's where kind of risk backwards, and that's where we start and where we get going.
And what made you really want to tackle that topic now? Why here? Why today? Why the 2026 Ruffer Review?
I think it's something that's both kind of eternal, and then as I started to explore the themes, I think there are some things that are particularly new, and you touched on some of them in the introduction, that made me focus on this risk backwards.
And what actually is risk backwards?
Yeah. So it's ways in which we get risk, I would say, the wrong way round. Back to front, literally backwards. And, there's often an element of paradox here. So, the safest options can actually turn out to be the most dangerous. And conversely, the routes that look like they've got a lot of hardship and uncertainty, well, actually, they can be more rewarding than they first seem. So that's still a pretty big topic. Yeah, maybe it's not a whole city, maybe it's a district in the city, the kind of London borough of risk backwards. And then the 3 themes that I look at that come together there's three that come together, and 2 that are long-term and one that's newer. So the first theme is about our deep human desire to belong, specifically to belong in a group, and that has a powerful pull. And then the second is a sheep-like tendency to follow the flock. And if we're honest, I think that has more of a pull on each of us than we care to admit, but that's powerful too. And these first 2 are kind of eternal ones. They've been around for thousands of years, and they kind of pull and influence how we think about risk. And then you overlay on the third, which I think is much newer, and that is that in the West, we live in a culture that I think is increasingly wired for comfort and for ease. So think of like an Uber Eats, Amazon Prime, click to buy now, Netflix, abundance of entertainment. This is the culture in. So you take these first 2 that are already pretty powerful around the desire to fit in, follow the flock, and then you overlay this culture that's increasingly wired for comfort. And those things come together in ways that I think can lead us to get risk the wrong way around, to get it backwards. And that's what I explore in the article.
And so the article takes us through 5 decades of your life, and you include 5 different antidotes or anecdotes that relate and are examples of risk backwards. Now, I'm afraid we're limited on time on this video podcast, so we're not going to get a chance to go through them all. But which one is your favourite? Which one would you really like our listeners to hear and take home?
So just one of the 5.
Just one of the 5.
Okay, that's fine. That's a clear. So if I had to pick one, I don't know if I'd say it was a favourite, but the one that seems to be getting the most impact would be the second decade. And that's the one that corresponds to our teenage years.
Yeah.
And I call the title Stress Test Convention. Yeah. So there was a brief moment, actually, when I was writing the article where I was the parent of 4 teenagers. Yeah. So by which I mean one of my girls became 13, and then 2 days later, the oldest one became 20. It was kind of like a parental eclipse. These things come together. And I think I get another one of those in 2029 or 2030. So, had 4 teenagers. In fact, one of a different one this weekend said to me, Dad, Immanuel Kant's definition of immaturity. And I thought, what have I done now? Where's this going? Yeah. So what do I say? That's a question from a 15-year-old. I've got some lived experience of teenagers and kind of what they're going through. And what I set out in this decade is, all right, let's look first at the conventional path. And the conventional path in, let's call them a Ruffer household, either us working here or our clients, would look something like do as well as you can at school, get the best grades, get into university. Let's say that's the conventional path. Risk backwards in this decade, I would say, is going down that route because your mum wants you to, or all your mates are, or your teachers are kind of pressuring you into do it. And what I encourage people to do is to stress test that convention and consider some alternatives. And I look at that from a number of different ways. But the one that seems to have resonated most is when I tell the story of my son, Benjamin, who's taking an alternative path. And
what does that alternative path look like for
Benjamin?
Him?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, where to start? So when he was 15, he said to me, Dad, I don't want a job in the Matrix.
Okay.
And sorry to break it to you, Gemma, but you and I, in his framing, we've got jobs deep in the Matrix, okay?
We're all in.
We're all in. We're in the office. We're in a school uniform. We're there.
Yeah.
And I can never remember which is the red or the blue pill, but we've taken the wrong one in his framing, right? So that's at 15. And so he leaves school at 16, which will probably come as a scandal to our kind of European and American listeners. Like, what do you mean in Britain you can leave school at 16, but you can? So he did that after he got his exam results. He was going to be a plumber. And then he pivoted at the last moment and he went to work in Morocco. He ended up on a motorcycle holiday tour business in the Atlas Mountains. And he learned a ton of stuff, did really well. He ended up with like 20,000 Moroccans following him on TikTok, all these kind of things. But he also ran out of money. And some of our parenting approach has parallels with the Austrian School of Economics. So there's a free market for consequences in our family, and there's no bailout. So he ran out of money, ended up having to come back to London. It was pretty hard then to find his feet. He then got an opportunity to shuck oysters, a day trial to do something. That led on to a job in the fishmonger. And to cut it all short, a couple of days before he turned 18, he's doing really well. They've given him a full-time job. He's working really hard. And he said, Dad, all my colleagues have got degrees. This is when he's just about to turn 18. He said, all my colleagues have got degrees. He said, I'm earning more than my teachers used to. And I feel like I've got a 5-year head start. Now, why do I think that's resonated with people? I mean, maybe it's a nice story, right? But I also feel a lot of teenagers and parents of teenagers, they're kind of grappling with similar things, right? And they can see this conventional path that works well for many, but it's not right for everybody. And I think you can increasingly see now out the other side of a graduate job, the market for, out the other side of a degree, the market for graduate jobs is really pretty tough. And they're looking at this conventional path and thinking, look, this isn't perhaps all the right fit for me or what it's cracked up to be. And then, but they're also sure, what are the alternatives? And those alternatives can seem a bit kind of scary and daunting. And so maybe just that story has landed well with people. And one of our readers has offered to buy me lunch. So it's at least one person seems to have connected with them.
So, Chris, we've heard about your favourite decade. I wondered if you could indulge me with mine. Mine was the Mary Poppins era.
Good choice, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely loved the film growing up. And you said in your article that you absolutely loved Mary Poppins because for her, disorder brings opportunity. Mm-hmm. Why did that mindset resonate with you personally?
Oh, sure. I think it's probably just a lot more fun. I think that's where I would start with her. It just is a much more rewarding life. And also it's much more resilient as well. And you see that play out through the film. And resilience, this idea of kind of toughness and elasticity together, I think these are good things. So that would be that. And I think for me, the film, it's not only Mary Poppins, strong character that she is and that we both like, but it's also the contrast between her and George Banks. Yeah, so that's kind of the way the drama unfolds. George Banks kind of embodies these Edwardian notions of order and stability, and on the surface, very good risk management. All his life is kind of there and neat and orderly and taken care of. But actually, under the surface, it's really quite fragile. And as the film plays out, those fragilities become exposed. Mary Poppins and other kind of disruptive agents exposes the fragilities. And then it's a Disney film, so it ends happily ever after, which is good. And he's out in the park flying a kite, and that's great to see. But yeah, Miss Mary Poppins not only is that kind of disruptive agent, but bringing something different and seeing the transformation through the film, I think that's what makes it work so well.
Yeah, it's a great film. Absolutely love it. So moving on, we're sat here today clearly in Ruffer's head office in London. Now, for me, I can see risk backwards in so many different places. We're unconstrained, we're unbenchmarked. We first focus on preserving capital, and then we look to generate returns for our clients. How do you see risk backwards here at Ruffer, not only in our investment philosophy, but also culturally too?
Yeah, I think you've covered a lot of the key points in the question there. What would I add on top? If I could say one thing that kind of sums up some of what we're about is that we seek to be different by design. Yeah? We seek to work from a set of first principles. They've been established since we started in the mid-1990s. They haven't changed. They've been tried and tested over 30 years. And we also seek to be clear in being different by design about what counts for us, what we care about, what's important and what's less important. So maybe rather than me do a kind of rougher advertising feature, maybe I could talk a bit about some of what I see elsewhere in our industry and how perhaps we're different to some of that.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah. So just a fraction, and maybe where to go. If I structure my thoughts under two headings, there's a whole category about what is risk and how our industry thinks about risk. And then there's a whole other category that's really important to us here is about responsibility. Yeah? So if we do the what is risk ones first, I mean, that was my Welsh summer holiday question. Yeah, come back to that. And if you're an investment professional, that's a pretty fundamental question, and it's important to have a strong answer. And a very conventional answer to that question in our industry is, risk is volatility. Yeah, and you say, okay, well, what's that then? And they say, it's the standard deviation of historic returns. And I'm like, okay, fine. Say that again. It's the standard deviation of historic returns. And obviously, yes, useful input into decision making. But what you're actually saying there, what that answer is really telling you is that someone's looking in the rear view mirror at what's already happened. And then they're doing some pretty basic maths in their spreadsheet. Yeah, and that spits out a number. And is that really your main definition of risk? We look at variance too. Well, that's just the square of the number you've given me. All right, so come on. So that would be one aspect of the answer to the question. You've then got things like tracking error. Yeah, our risk is tracking relative to a benchmark. I mean, love a duck, right? What's that got to do with real people in the real world with real hopes, real fears, putting real capital at risk with real consequences when people get risk backwards? Or another thing that we see is taking a concept that makes sense in one domain, one area of the market, and almost like thoughtlessly copying and pasting it to another. Yeah. So an example there would be in the equity markets, market cap weighted indices, they make a great deal of sense. Yeah. Copy and paste that to the fixed income market. And I look at that and say, that makes no sense at all. Yeah. Because what you're doing there is you're essentially saying, well, the bigger the debtor, the higher the weight they have in the index. And then a lot of passive tracking products just end up putting more flow and more money into the biggest debtors. I mean, copy paste makes no sense. So those some of the, the thoughts on kind of what is risk and how the industry, I think, doesn't spend enough time looking at the substance of true risk.
And then the other element that you mentioned was responsibility.
Yes.
Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
So, in my view, most professional investors take too much credit and too little responsibility. Yeah. Most professional investors take too much credit, particularly when things are going well, and too little responsibility, and particularly when things are going badly. And then, many professional advisors, financial advisors and consultants, what they often end up doing is actually outsourcing some of the key responsibilities for managing risk. And they do that often encouraged by regulation. Sometimes there's incentives at play, sometimes there's fears at play. So that, they're doing it for understandable reasons. But again, what does this mean for the client? Yeah, who's actually responsible when things aren't going so well? So that would be there. And then, a different part, and we've seen a lot of growth here, would be the rise of DIY investing. So, that's people managing their own investment on the platform, making their own decisions through their phones or their laptops. And I mean, I think the first thing to say that there's a lot there to be applauded. Yeah, I'm not sitting here with you today and we're saying, okay, you must trust the professionals. Here's the professional active manager saying, trust the professional active manager professional. I mean, give me a break, right? I'm definitely not saying that. In fact, the opposite. So George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, he said most professions are a conspiracy against the laity. Yeah, and a conspiracy, not in the sense of there's a secret plot that we've cooked up, but just in the sense of kind of perpetuating their own interests, informal collusion to do it. And I really believe in that. He said that, I think it was 1905, 1906. And I actually think that's one of the most underappreciated trends in modern business, that and Parkinson's law. Yeah, Parkinson's law is work expands to fill the time available to do it in. So I think those two are really underappreciated trends in business and economics, but that's probably a different conversation. Your responsibility and DIY investing. Let's say that makes sense. 97% of the time. Yeah. Let's say wearing that responsibility as a DIY investor for your own financial future, let's say that's fine 97% of the time. Now I've made that number up. Yeah, it's an oversimplification, but let's just go with the oversimplification. The challenge comes in the 3% of the time. And actually it's probably in the 0.03%, but let's just say the 3%. So, you know financial history, yeah, and you've seen the same studies I have that show the returns you would get investing in the stock market for 100 years. Yeah, look, if you've been fully invested in UK stocks or US stocks, for 100 years, you'd get X%. Yeah. But then you've probably also seen those studies where they say, well, if you missed the best 10 days, yeah, or the best 10 weeks, that X really plummets to Y and Z. And I don't know about you, but as I've read those, I'm like, oh, surely that can't be right. Surely just 10 days or 10 weeks in 100 years don't make that much difference. But they do, yeah, because returns are not normally distributed. There's a huge skew at play here. And why that really matters is for the end investor is because so much of investing is about managing your emotions. Yeah. So much of investing is about temperament and understanding your own psychology and the psychological biases and how we respond under pressure. And of course, analysis is important. Of course, judgment's important. Intuition is also important in different ways. But psychology is really important. And if you are taking responsibility for managing your own money, then it's in those, I call it the 3%, the broad 3% of times where that really matters. And that can matter both in a boom and a bust. Yeah, and I could talk about some examples of both of those if you're happy. But the boom examples I come back to, one of them is historic and one of them is recent. Yeah, so the historic one is Sir Isaac Newton. And he invested in the South Sea, what we now know as the South Sea bubble. It was the South Sea Trading Company then. And he got in pretty early. The stock did really well. He sold out for a big profit, and then the stock kept going up. Yeah, and then he got back in just before the top, and he crashed and he lost it all. Right, so that's Sir Isaac Newton. And a more recent example, less kind of dramatic example, would be Stan Druckenmiller. So Druckenmiller, one of the greatest investors in our generation, and I was watching an interview with him at the weekend, where he talked about managing his own psychology. He talked about it with great humility through his holding of NVIDIA. And he was there early, had high conviction how this was going to play out. He held it up, I think, for a 6-fold gain. It went on to go further, and he struggled and wrestled with this, right? So, if these two, Sir Isaac Newton and Stan Druckenmiller are struggling, then I think it's going to be pretty important for everybody else as well. So that's in a boom. And in a bust, that's really important too, yeah? Because, if you open up your portfolio and it's down 30, 40, 50%, that is mega stress. Yeah. And again, if you're a DIY investor, you've taken that responsibility on. That is mega stress. And unfortunately, what we see time and time again is it's just too much for us to handle. Right? And people end up selling out at the worst possible moment or close to the worst possible moment and either say, look, I never want to deal with this investing again. I'm just going to sit in cash. And that then gets really eroded by inflation over the long term. Or, the market picks back up and then they get back in again, but then they've missed the best 10 days or the best 10 weeks. So, it's mega stress and it's a responsibility. And I suppose the question is, do you really want that responsibility? How much that responsibility do you want versus, being able to go and take your dog for a walk or play Perudo with your friends? So if I can just do a brief contrast with Ruffer, with all of that, when we think about responsibility, we take on the responsibility. That's what we're paid to do. We take on the responsibility for managing risk in all its dimensions, at all times, in all its forms. We shoulder that on behalf of our clients. We really wear that, and we really feel that, particularly when we're not doing as well. We seek to do that for the reasons that you touched on at the beginning, starting with a focus, preoccupied, keep the client safe, focus on capital preservation, and look to build from there.
And I wonder if I can just play devil's advocate for a moment. Please forgive me, but I think some of our listeners or watchers at home might be thinking, but Chris, sometimes the consensus is right.
Yes.
Sometimes being in the herd is actually genuinely the safest option. So how do you reconcile that with your antidotes to risk backwards?
Sure. I totally agree. I totally agree with everything you just said, and I think that's really important. So again, in investing, the same Stan Druckenmiller interview I talked about before, he talks about his former boss, George Soros, said the consensus is right 80% of the time. Now, that's another round number that he probably made up, like my 97%, but it's right 80% of the time. It's the 20% you need your wits about you. What else? When I go to the dentist, I'm really happy with the conventional approach, right? I don't want to put in tomato ketchup in my ear, Or if we're sat on a plane, we're at Heathrow Airport and about to take off, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to try something different today, right? That's the pilot. Like, get me out of here. Yeah. So convention, it works, and even the example we talked about earlier. So I talked about my son Benjamin. His older sister, she was an A-star student. She's gone on to a great university. That's a good path for her. That fits well. So absolutely fine. So look, I'm not trying to make big, broad statements about this whole city of risk. Yeah, I'm just trying to explore a few little streets and hopefully bring something useful for the readers, and they deal with it as they will.
Okay, so I'm afraid that we're approaching the end of our time together, but just before I let you go, I wondered if you could let me and our listeners at home know, what do you think is one book, one film, and one habit that best inoculate against risk backwards?
Okay. So I knew you were going to ask for a bonus item.
Yeah.
I think if we start talking about books, Dal would be here all day. So I'm going to skip that. Okay.
Okay.
And what I'll give you instead is a work of art.
Right.
And
I wasn't expecting that.
Well, there we go. So it's one that I came across recently, and it's by Rembrandt, and it's called something like Jesus clears the money changers from the temple, or Christ clears the temple of money changers, something like that. And I came across it recently because a friend of mine works just down the road from us at Christie's, and they had this big sale, big collection of Rembrandt prints. And in this whole collection, this one was my favourite. And it was my favourite, but it also lines up with a lot of what we've been talking about and exploring the article. So in this print, you've got Jesus at the centre, Jesus who embodies a radically different approach to safety and risk. Yeah, and if you come back to my three themes on my three little streets, Jesus who kind of shunned the convention, wasn't interested in the applause of the crowd or the approval of the elite. Someone who was described as a good shepherd, so not a follower sheep, and certainly wasn't interested in comfort and ease, kind of embrace the hardship. And he's in the centre of this picture, and he's acting. Yeah, he's acting. He sees that something wrong, and he takes on the responsibility for doing something about it. So that's that. And then you've got Rembrandt in all his mastery, in all his brilliance and majesty of light and dark. And this thing is an etching. And my friend who was showing me around explained some of how etching worked, and it was just, I was blown away. And so you've got Jesus in the centre of the picture. Rembrandt gives him with all this dynamism and energy, almost like bursts out of the page. But then it's really funny as well. Yeah, and we talked about Mary Poppins earlier. Rembrandt, he has these money changers. They're all over the place, right? One of them's getting pulled along by a cow. Another one's making a mad dive for a pigeon. He just brings this warmth and humour to it. And so I've probably broken like a golden rule of podcasting and tried to describe a work of art. But that's the bonus item I'd give. By Rembrandt, Jesus clears the money changers from the temple.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning, Chris. And thank you everyone at home who's been listening or watching. If Risk Backwards and what we've discussed today has resonated with you, please do go online and read our latest Ruffer Review 2026, where we talk about Chris's article, Risk Backwards. We'll also link it in today's show notes. Thank you so much.